Hello, and welcome to Morpheus Sleepy History, a place where history slows down, and the past becomes a peaceful journey into sleep. Here, we explore the stories of ancient worlds, lost civilizations, medieval kingdoms, and forgotten travelers, all told slowly, gently, and without hurry. This is not a fast history lesson. There are no loud moments here. Each episode is designed to help you relax, unwind, and slowly drift into sleep while listening to the quiet echoes of the past. So whether you're already lying in bed or just getting comfortable for the night, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, relax your shoulders, let the day fade away. And as tonight's story unfolds, no need to stay awake for every detail. You can simply listen. Let your imagination wander through distant centuries, and if sleep arrives before the story ends, that's perfectly okay. After all, this is sleepy history. So close your eyes if you'd like. Get comfortable, breathe slowly, and let's begin our quiet journey into the past. Chapter 1. Today we will travel to the distant Middle Ages, a time of slow roads, stone cities, and the ringing of church bells. This is a story about people who left their homes and set out on a journey, thousands of kilometers long. A story about faith, about fear, about hope. But today we will tell it calmly and slowly, without haste, as if we were sitting by a warm fireplace in an old stone house. Outside the windows, the night is quiet. Somewhere far away, the wind is howling, and in front of us lies an old chronicle, its pages slightly yellowed with time. We open it and begin to read. Imagine Europe more than 900 years ago. It was a different world. No cars, no trains, no airplanes. There were not even the roads we are used to today. Most routes were narrow strips of earth, worn down by the feet of travelers and the hooves of horses. After rain, they turned into thick mud. In summer, they were covered with dust. Sometimes these roads passed through dense forests. The forests of medieval Europe were enormous, much thicker than they are today. Tall oaks and beeches stretched toward the sky. Between them grew shrubs and moss. Sunlight barely broke through the leaves. Wolves lived in these forests. Wild boars, deer. Sometimes travelers heard their voices at night. That is why travel was dangerous. But people still set out on the road, sometimes for trade, sometimes for war, and sometimes for faith. At the center of our story stands a city, a sacred city, Jerusalem, a city that for thousands of years had been a place of prayer and pilgrimage. For millions of people, it was considered the most important place on earth. According to Christian tradition, it was here that Jesus Christ lived and preached. Here the events described in the Gospels took place. And here, as Christians believed, was the Holy Sepulchre. For this reason, for many centuries people traveled there from many different corners of Europe. Some walked for months, others for years. They crossed mountains. They passed through rivers. Sometimes they had to sail across stormy seas. Many of them never returned home. But still people kept going, because for them it was not simply a journey. It was a spiritual trial. Pilgrims often traveled on foot. They took only a few things with them: a cloak, a staff, a small bag with bread. Sometimes they wore a pilgrim's sign on their hat or cloak, a shell or a cross. Along the road they met other travelers, and gradually small groups turned into long caravans of people. Some roads of Europe became real streams of pilgrims. They walked through France, through Germany, through Italy, through the lands of Byzantium, and further to the east. Sometimes they stopped in monasteries. The monks gave them water and bread. Sometimes travelers slept simply under the open sky. They lit a fire and listened to the sounds of the night. Sometimes among the pilgrims were wealthy people, knights, merchants, noble lords, but most often they were ordinary people, peasants. For many of them, such a journey was the greatest event of their lives. Most people in the Middle Ages almost never left their village. Their world was very small. Sometimes it was limited to just a few kilometers around their home. But stories about the holy city of Jerusalem spread throughout Europe. And over time this city became a symbol of faith, a symbol of a spiritual journey, a symbol of a distant land where sacred events had taken place. And one day, at the end of the 11th century, the journey to this city became something much greater. It stopped being only a pilgrimage. It turned into a movement that would change the history of an entire continent. But to understand how this happened, we need to pause for a moment and look more closely at Europe of that time. Imagine a small village somewhere in France. Early morning, mist lies over the fields. The roofs of wooden houses are covered with dew. A thin thread of smoke rises from a chimney. People are already waking up. Peasants come out of their homes. Someone walks toward the fields. Someone leads a cow to pasture. Someone carries water from the well. Life moves slowly and calmly. In the center of the village stands a church. Sometimes it is made of stone, sometimes of wood. On its tower hangs a bell, and suddenly that bell begins to ring. Its sound spreads far across the fields. People hear it, and they know that a new day has begun. The bell in a medieval village was very important. It rang in the morning. It rang in the evening. It rang on feast days. It rang when something important happened. Sometimes it rang to warn of a fire or danger. But most often its sound reminded people of God. Faith occupied a central place in the lives of medieval people. It was part of every day. People prayed in the morning, prayed before meals, prayed in the evening. They believed that the world was arranged according to the will of God, that every event had spiritual meaning, that the trials that happened in life had a purpose, and that is why stories about the holy city of Jerusalem were so important. For many people it seemed almost like a heavenly place, a city where the earth touches the sky, a city that connects the world of people and the world of God. And gradually one idea began to spread across Europe. The idea that the road to this city could become a great undertaking, a journey that could change destiny. And not only the destiny of one person, but the destiny of entire nations. But for now people did not yet know what awaited them. They simply lived their lives, worked in the fields, built houses, prayed, and listened to stories. Stories about distant lands, about cities in the east, about caravans crossing deserts, about seas that seemed endless. These stories were passed from mouth to mouth, and gradually they became part of Europe's imagination. And somewhere far away at the other end of the world stood a city, an ancient city, a sacred city, a city that would become the center of a great movement, the city of Jerusalem. And it is there, through years and thousands of kilometers of roads, that one day thousands of people will set out. But that is already the beginning of another chapter of our story. Chapter 2. To understand why the Crusades began, we must imagine Europe as it was at that time. It was a very different Europe, not the one we know today. Modern states with clear borders did not yet exist. There were no large cities connected by networks of roads and railways. There were no newspapers, radio, or the internet that could quickly spread news. The world was slow, very slow. News could travel for weeks and sometimes for months. If an important event happened in one kingdom, people in another might learn about it only after a long time. Sometimes rumors changed along the way. Stories grew larger, sometimes more frightening. But this was how ideas spread. Through stories, through sermons, through wandering monks, through merchants who traveled from city to city. Europe of the 11th century was a continent of villages. Most people lived in them. Small settlements surrounded by fields, forests, and rivers. Houses were usually built from wood. Roofs were covered with straw. The floors inside were made of packed earth. In winter such houses kept warmth poorly. so people gathered close to the hearth. The fire was the center of the home. It gave light, it gave warmth, and around it the family gathered. In the evenings people told stories. Sometimes they were tales of ancient kings, sometimes legends about saints, sometimes stories about distant lands. For many villagers, the world beyond the nearest hills seemed almost like a fairy tale. They knew that somewhere there were great cities, somewhere there were vast seas, somewhere there were lands described by pilgrims and merchants. But most of them would never see those places with their own eyes. Life was tied to the land. In spring people plowed the fields. In summer they cared for the crops. In autumn they harvested grain. In winter they tried to survive the cold. Work was hard, but it was familiar. Generations of people lived the same way. Sons continued the work of their fathers. Daughters helped their mothers. And life flowed slowly, almost the same from year to year. But in the center of almost every village there was one special place: the church. Sometimes it was small, sometimes a little larger, but for the villagers it had enormous importance. It was not just a building, it was the center of life. The bell on the church tower could be heard far away. Its sound spread across fields and forests. When the bell rang in the morning, people knew a new day had begun. When it rang in the evening, it was time to return home. When it rang on a feast day, people put on their best clothes and gathered for service. When it rang slowly and sadly, it meant someone had died. In this way, the bell seemed to unite the entire village. It reminded people that they lived together and that their lives were connected not only to the land, but also to faith. Religion in medieval Europe was not simply a part of life, it was its foundation. People saw the world through the lens of faith. They believed that God guided everything that happened, that the harvest depended on God's will, that illness was a test, that prayer could change fate. Because of this, the church played an enormous role. Priests explained the meaning of events. They told stories from the Bible. They spoke about saints, about miracles, about heaven and hell. These stories shaped people's understanding of the world. And in these stories one city was often mentioned: Jerusalem, the holy city. A city that was far away, yet very close in people's imagination. Many had heard about it since childhood. Priests told of the events that happened there, about the life of Jesus Christ, about his sermons, about the cross, about the resurrection. So for many people, Jerusalem was not simply a geographic place. It was part of the spiritual map of the world, a place toward which the heart of a believer longed. But the road there was incredibly long. If a person decided to go on a pilgrimage, they had to prepare for a journey that might last for years. First, they had to pass through many European lands, through France, through Germany, through Italy, through the Balkans. Sometimes pilgrims walked on foot. Sometimes they rode horses. Sometimes they sailed on ships. Each stage of the journey was a trial. Roads could be dangerous. Bandits sometimes hid in forests. Rivers could flood after heavy rain. Mountains were difficult to cross. But even after all these hardships, the journey was not over, because ahead lay a vast empire in the east, the Byzantine Empire. This state was the heir of ancient Rome. Its people spoke Greek. Their culture differed from that of Western Europe. Their capital was one of the greatest cities in the world. This city was called Constantinople. For people in Western Europe, it seemed almost legendary. Many had heard of its wealth, of its enormous walls, of its magnificent churches. Imagine a city standing on the shores of a strait. On one side, Europe. On the other, Asia. Ships from all over the world arrive in its harbors. In its markets one could see goods from distant lands. Silk from China, spices from India, glass from Syria, precious stones from Persia. The streets of the city were noisy and crowded. Merchants loudly discussed prices. Travelers shared news. Priests walked toward the churches. Soldiers guarded the gates. And above all of this rose one of the most famous churches in the world. The Hagia Sophia. Its enormous dome seemed to float above the city. When sunlight passed through its windows, the interior filled with a golden glow. For people who came from small villages in Europe, Constantinople seemed unbelievable. It was larger than any city they could imagine. Sometimes pilgrims stayed there for several days, sometimes for several weeks. They rested after their long journey. They listened to the stories of local people. They watched the ships in the harbor. But beyond this city began another world. The world of the Middle East. Lands where the climate was hotter, where the landscapes differed from the green forests of Europe, where instead of thick oak groves one could see dry hills and rocky plains. For Europeans, these lands seemed mysterious, sometimes even frightening, but it was through them that the road to Jerusalem passed. And it was there, at the crossroads of cultures and religions, that tension slowly began to grow. The medieval world was complex. Different states competed with one another. Different religions existed side by side, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in conflict. And by the end of the 11th century, these tensions began to increase. In the East, events were unfolding that gradually attracted the attention of Europe. The rulers of the Byzantine Empire were facing new enemies. Turkish armies were advancing farther west. Some cities changed hands. Roads became less safe. Sometimes pilgrims encountered difficulties. Sometimes they returned home with troubling stories. These stories spread throughout Europe. People listened to them. Sometimes they exaggerated them. Sometimes they added new details. But gradually a feeling began to grow that serious changes were happening in the East, and that the fate of the holy places might be under threat. In monasteries, monks discussed this news. In castles, knights listened to travelers' stories. In cities, merchants exchanged rumors. And gradually, the idea that Europe should turn its attention to the East began to strengthen. But for now, no one knew what the next step would be. No one could imagine that very soon an event would occur that would change the course of history. An event that would begin with a single speech. A speech delivered in the square of a small French town. That speech would inspire thousands of people. It would cause knights to leave their castles, peasants their villages, and monks their monasteries. People would begin preparing for a journey thousands of kilometers long, a journey that would enter history under the name the Crusades. But we will talk about that in the next chapter. Chapter 3. In the autumn of 1095, an event took place that would later be called one of the most important in the history of the Middle Ages. In a small French town, people gathered from across Europe. This town was called Claremont. Today it seems like a quiet and peaceful place. But at the end of the 11th century, it was here that an event occurred that would change the lives of thousands. Autumn had already arrived. Leaves on the trees had begun to turn yellow. The air was growing cooler. Sometimes a light morning mist rose above the town. Along the narrow streets of Claremont moved groups of people. Some arrived on horseback. Others came on foot. On the roads one could see knights in chainmail, monks in dark robes, priests, merchants, and ordinary townspeople. They had come for a great church gathering. In the Middle Ages, such meetings were called councils. At them, important questions of the church, politics, and the life of the Christian world were discussed. But this gathering would become special. It was led by the Pope, Pope Urban I. He was the spiritual leader of Western Christianity, a man whose words were listened to by kings, bishops, and knights. When the Pope traveled across Europe, people gathered to hear his sermons. And now he had arrived in Claremont. The town square gradually filled. People gathered in groups. Some discussed news. Some prayed. Some simply waited. On the square one could see representatives of many different parts of society. Bishops in rich church garments, knights in long cloaks, monks, and ordinary people who had come to hear the Pope's words. Many understood that something important would be said. But no one yet knew how deeply this speech would influence history. That day the weather was cool but clear. The autumn sun illuminated the roofs of the houses. A quiet expectation hung over the square. And finally Pope Urban I rose to speak to the gathered crowd. We do not know the exact words he spoke. The chronicles of that time recount his speech slightly differently, but its meaning has been preserved. The Pope spoke about events in the East. He spoke about the holy places, about the city of Jerusalem, about the lands where the events of the Bible had taken place. He spoke about the difficulties faced by Christian pilgrims, about conflicts and wars in those lands. He reminded people of the spiritual importance of the holy city, of the fact that it mattered to the entire Christian world. The Pope's speech was powerful. He spoke not only as a political leader, he spoke as a spiritual shepherd. His words appealed to people's faith. He called upon the knights of Europe to travel to the East, to help protect the Holy Lands, to help those who lived there, to help the pilgrims who continued to travel to Jerusalem. But there was also another important promise in his words. The Pope said that those who set out on this journey with sincere faith would have their sins forgiven. For people of the Middle Ages, this was extremely important. Faith occupied a central place in their lives. Many feared punishment for their sins. Many longed for forgiveness. And so the Pope's words sounded very powerful. The crowd listened carefully. At first people stood in silence, but gradually tension began to grow in the air. People looked at one another. Some nodded. Some whispered prayers. And suddenly a voice was heard in the crowd. Then another. And then more and more people began repeating the same phrase. A phrase in Latin, Deus vult. It meant, God wills it. At first only a few people said it, but soon it began spreading across the entire square. People repeated it again and again. Deus vult, Deus vult, Deus vult. This phrase became a symbol of the Crusades, a symbol of the idea that the coming journey was not simply a war. It was a spiritual mission. After this event, the news began to spread quickly across Europe. Travelers carried it to different towns and kingdoms. Monks told about the Pope's speech in monasteries. Priests repeated its message in their sermons. Knights discussed it in castles. And gradually one idea began spreading across Europe. The idea of a great journey to the East. Knights began to prepare. Some sold their lands. Others mortgaged their property. Some gathered money for the journey. Others searched for allies. The journey promised to be long and dangerous, but many were ready for it, because they believed they were taking part in a great cause. In time, a special symbol appeared. People began sewing a small cross of cloth onto their clothing, sometimes red, sometimes another color. This cross was worn on a cloak or on the chest. Thus the sign of the Crusaders appeared. From this came the word itself, crusaders, people who carry the cross. For many of them, this symbol meant more than participation in the campaign. It meant a spiritual commitment, a promise to complete the journey. Sometimes ceremonies of taking the cross took place directly in churches. A knight would stand before the altar. A priest would bless him, and then the cross would be attached to his clothing. After this, the person was considered a participant in the crusade. But among those who decided to go were not only knights. The Crusaders included many different kinds of people: noble lords, minor nobles, peasants, merchants, priests, monks, even simple craftsmen. Some went for religious reasons. Others sought adventure. Some hoped to find wealth. Some hoped for new land. But they were united by one idea: the journey to the East. Sometimes in villages, touching scenes unfolded. A knight prepared for the road. His family stood beside him. His wife held his hand. His children looked at him with concern, because no one knew whether he would return home. Some people understood that the journey might be their last, but they still chose to go, because faith at that time was very strong. People felt they were part of an event of enormous importance. Gradually, the first groups of crusaders began moving along the roads of Europe. Some departed from France, others from Germany, others from Italy. At first these were small groups, but over time they grew larger. On the roads one could see long columns of people, horses, wagons, pilgrims with staffs, knights in armor, and ahead of all of them lay the same path, the path to the east, the path to the holy city of Jerusalem. This road was long, very long. It passed through mountains, through rivers, through many states, but people were ready for it, because they believed they were taking part in a great story, a story that was only just beginning. Soon thousands of people would begin moving along the roads of Europe, leaving behind their homes, their fields, their towns. They would walk for weeks, for months, sometimes for years, until at last they reached the borders of the distant east. But many trials still awaited them: roads, hunger, disease, and long sieges of cities. But for now all of this was only beginning. The first steps had already been taken, and Europe had begun to move, slowly but inevitably, toward one of the most famous events of the Middle Ages, the Crusades. Chapter 4. When we talk about the Crusades, we often imagine enormous armies. We imagine knights in shining armor, long rows of soldiers, banners waving in the wind, horses covered in heavy armor. But in reality, there were many more kinds of people among the Crusaders. They were not only armies, it was an entire movement. Thousands of people from different parts of Europe decided to travel to the east, and among them were many different lives and stories. Knights, peasants, merchants, priests, monks, craftsmen, sometimes even children. Some were wealthy, others were very poor, but they were united by one idea: the journey to the east, the journey to the holy city of Jerusalem. Imagine an early morning in one of the villages of Europe. The sun is just beginning to rise above the forest. A light mist lies over the fields. The grass is covered with dew. The air is cool and quiet. On the narrow road at the edge of the village stands a group of people. Some hold walking staffs. Others carry bags with their belongings. Someone leads a horse. Someone pushes a small cart. People speak quietly to one another. Some pray. Some look down the road that disappears into the distance. Today they are beginning their journey, a journey thousands of kilometers long. Some of them have never left their village before. All their lives they worked on the same field, went to the same church, saw the same hills. But now they are preparing to cross an entire continent, through cities and rivers, through forests and mountains, toward distant lands they had only heard about in stories. Sometimes the farewells were quiet. Families stood by the road. Wives held the hands of their husbands. Mothers embraced their sons. Children looked at the departing travelers with concern and curiosity. No one knew how long the journey would take, or whether they would return at all. But the road was already waiting, and gradually the first groups of crusaders began to move, first along narrow rural paths, then along wider roads that connected cities. Sometimes these groups grew larger. Along the way new people joined them. A small group could slowly become a long column of travelers. They moved slowly, very slowly, because among them were not only warriors. There were elderly people, there were women, there were children. Sometimes carts carried supplies. Sometimes people carried their belongings on their shoulders. The road became part of their new life. In the morning people woke at dawn. They gathered their belongings. Sometimes they ate a little bread, and once again they set out. By evening they searched for a place to sleep. Sometimes it was a clearing beside the road, sometimes a village, sometimes a monastery where monks gave travelers water and food. When night fell, people lit fires. Groups of travelers gathered around them. Someone told stories. Someone prayed. Someone simply sat quietly, watching the flames. Above them the stars slowly appeared. The sky was dark and deep. Without city lights it seemed endless. Sometimes someone remembered home. a distant village, forests, rivers, the field they had left behind, and then a quiet sadness appeared. But nearby were other travelers, and they all shared the same goal that helped them continue. Sometimes the road passed through large cities. For many crusaders, this was an astonishing experience. Some of them had never seen a city before. High stone walls, towers, large gates, narrow streets filled with people. In the markets, people sold cloth, bread, fruit, jugs, tools. Merchants loudly called out to customers. People spoke different languages. For peasants from small villages, all of this seemed incredible. But there was little time to stay. The journey was long, and new lands awaited them ahead. At first, many crusaders traveled through France, then through the lands of Germany. The roads here grew longer. Sometimes they passed through dense forests, sometimes across wide plains, sometimes through mountain passes. The weather could change quickly. During the day it was warm. At night it became cold. Sometimes rain fell, and the roads turned into mud. Carts became stuck. Horses grew tired. People moved even more slowly. But even then the columns continued forward, step by step, kilometer by kilometer. Over time, many crusaders reached the Balkans. These lands were different from the Europe they knew. The mountains grew higher. The roads became harder. Sometimes paths ran along steep slopes. On one side rose rocky cliffs. On the other opened deep valleys. Sometimes travelers stopped on a hilltop and looked into the distance. Beyond the horizon lay new lands, and somewhere far ahead, the holy city of Jerusalem. But before reaching it, the Crusaders would encounter one of the greatest cities of that time. A city many of them knew only from stories. A city that seemed almost legendary. Constantinople. For people from Western Europe, it was the largest city they could imagine. When Crusaders first approached it, they often stopped in amazement. Before them rose enormous walls. High, massive, they stretched for many kilometers. Towers rose above the city. Flags waved in the wind. And behind the walls one could see the domes of churches. Some of them shone with gold in the sunlight. Ships stood in the harbor. Large merchant vessels. Small boats. Sails slowly moved in the wind. For people who had spent their lives in small villages, this city seemed unbelievable. Some stood silently, simply staring at its walls. Some prayed. Some spoke to each other about how enormous the city was. Constantinople was the gateway between two worlds, between Europe and Asia. And it was here that many crusaders first truly felt how far they had come from home. Because beyond this city began the East, a world that was almost unknown to them. A world of new languages, new cultures, new landscapes. A world where the green forests of Europe gradually gave way to rocky hills and dry plains. And ahead of them lay an even more difficult part of the journey. But for now the Crusaders stood before the massive walls of Constantinople and looked at the city that seemed like a miracle. They did not yet know how many trials awaited them. They knew only one thing. Their journey was continuing, and ahead lay the road to the east. Chapter 5. When the first Crusader armies reached the eastern borders of Europe, they entered the lands of a vast state. This was the Byzantine Empire, an ancient and powerful realm. Its people considered themselves the heirs of the Roman Empire, the same empire that had once ruled nearly the entire Mediterranean world. Although the Roman Empire had long disappeared in the west, in the east it continued to live on. Here it was known by another name, Byzantium. Its capital was one of the greatest cities of its time, the city of Constantinople. When the Crusaders first saw its walls, many of them were astonished. They had never seen anything like it. High stone walls stretched for many kilometers. Some consisted of several lines of fortifications. In front of the walls ran a deep moat. Towers rose high above the city. Soldiers stood guard on the battlements. These defenses were considered among the strongest in the world. For centuries, they had protected the city from enemies. Many armies had tried to capture Constantinople, but almost none had managed to break through its walls. When the Crusaders approached the city gates, they felt small beside these massive fortifications. For many of them, this was the largest city they had ever seen. Inside the walls of Constantinople, life was bustling. The streets were filled with people. Merchants brought goods from across the known world. In the markets, one could see brightly colored fabrics, silk, carpets, spices, rare fruits. Jewelers sold golden ornaments. Potters displayed jars and bowls. Different languages could be heard everywhere: Greek, Arabic, Latin, Armenian, Persian. Constantinople was a place where the cultures of East and West met. But what impressed the Crusaders most were the churches. There were many of them. Domes rose above the city. Some were covered in gold. When sunlight struck them, they shone so brightly that they could be seen from afar. The most famous church was the Hagia Sophia. Its enormous dome seemed almost weightless. Inside, the church was decorated with mosaics. Golden images of saints covered the walls. Light passed through the windows and reflected from marble columns. For people accustomed to small village churches, it was an incredible sight. They looked at this temple and felt that they were standing in the center of a vast and ancient world. But while the Crusaders gazed at the city in amazement, one man watched them with caution. This was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Alexios I Komnenos. He was an experienced ruler, and he understood very well what was happening around his empire. When the emperor heard that huge armies of Western knights were moving toward his capital, he first felt concern, because such armies could become a danger. The Crusaders were numerous. They did not always follow strict discipline. Among them were many people who had never been in large cities before. Sometimes such armies could cause disorder, but the emperor also understood another side of the situation. For many years his empire had faced difficulties. In the east, its lands were gradually being captured by Turkish armies. Some cities and fortresses had already been lost. Therefore, the help of Western knights could prove useful. The emperor decided to act carefully. He invited the leaders of the Crusaders for negotiations. These meetings took place in the palaces of Constantinople. The halls of the palace were decorated with marble and gold. Walls were covered with rich fabrics. Servants brought food and drink. For Western knights, all this seemed unusual. The Byzantine court was different from the castles of Western Europe. It was more luxurious, more complex, sometimes even a little mysterious. During the negotiations, the emperor set an important condition. He demanded that the leaders of the Crusaders swear an oath. They had to promise to return to Byzantium all lands that had once belonged to the empire. If the Crusaders recaptured these territories from their enemies, they would give them back to the empire. For the emperor, this was very important. He hoped the crusade would help recover lost cities. Some crusader leaders agreed to this oath. Others did so reluctantly. But in the end, most accepted the emperor's terms, because without his help, continuing the journey would have been difficult. Constantinople controlled the important straits, and it was through them that the Crusaders had to reach Asia Minor. Eventually, the armies began preparing for the crossing. Across the Bosporus, this narrow stretch of water separates Europe and Asia. From one shore, the other side can be seen. Yet it is already another continent. Ships slowly carried people, horses, and wagons across the water, one after another. When the Crusaders stepped onto the land of Asia Minor, many of them felt their journey had entered a new stage. Now they were truly in the east. The landscapes gradually changed. Forests became rarer. Rocky hills appeared. The sun felt hotter. Roads became dusty. Sometimes ancient cities could be seen on the horizon. Some had existed for centuries. Roman legions had once marched here. Fortresses had been built here. Trade caravans had passed along these roads. Now the Crusaders moved through these lands. But the journey was far from easy, because in Asia Minor they faced a new enemy, the Seljuk Turks. These warriors knew the land well. They moved quickly, and often attacked unexpectedly. So the Crusaders had to move carefully. They built camps, placed guards. Knights kept their weapons close. Sometimes small clashes occurred. Sometimes the armies simply continued forward, because their goal lay far ahead, the holy city of Jerusalem. But before reaching it, they still had to cross long and difficult roads, through mountains, across plains, across the heartlands of Anatolia. And it was there that one of the hardest parts of their journey would begin, because the land of Asia Minor would prove far harsher than the green forests of Europe. And many crusaders would feel for the first time how difficult the road to the east could be. But everything was only beginning. The armies had already crossed the boundary between two worlds, and new trials awaited them. Trials of the road, of heat, of hunger, and of the unknown. Yet they continued forward, because their goal still lay ahead. Chapter 6. The lands of Anatolia were harsh. When the Crusaders first moved deeper into Asia Minor, many felt they had entered a completely different world. The Europe they had left behind was green. There were dense forests, rivers flowing between hills, meadows covered with grass. But here everything looked different. Rocky plains stretched before them. Distant hills rose above the horizon. Sometimes the land seemed almost empty. Forests were much rarer. Trees were smaller, and the sun shone brighter and stronger. During the day the air became hot. Dust rose beneath the feet of men and the hooves of horses. The roads became dry and stony. Sometimes they crossed wide steppes. Sometimes they climbed mountain passes. The Crusaders moved slowly, very slowly, because such a huge army could not move quickly. Among them were knights in heavy armor, infantry soldiers, peasants, pilgrims, wagons carrying supplies, horses and mules. Sometimes the army traveled only a few kilometers in a day. The road demanded patience. Morning began early. When the first rays of sunlight appeared over the horizon, the camp slowly came to life. People woke up, fires were lit, simple meals were prepared. Sometimes it was only bread, sometimes dried meat, sometimes cheese. Water was especially important, and sometimes there was not enough. So when the army found a spring or a river, people filled their flasks. Horses drank, soldiers rested. Then the journey continued, step by step. Sometimes people walked in silence. They needed to conserve their strength. Sometimes they talked, told stories, remembered their homes. Sometimes they sang quiet songs. But the most difficult thing was not only the distance, it was the uncertainty. Many crusaders had never seen landscapes like these. They were used to the green forests of Europe, soft grass, rivers flowing through valleys. Here there were dry plains, stone roads, hot winds. Sometimes the wind carried dust. The air became thick and cloudy. People covered their faces with cloaks. Horses lowered their heads. But the army continued. Chapter 7. One of the most important cities on the Crusaders' path was Antioch. This city was ancient, very ancient. It had existed for many centuries. Once Antioch had been one of the largest cities of the ancient world. It was founded during the time of Greek rulers, long before the Roman Empire reached its peak. Later the city became part of the vast Roman state. Important trade routes passed through it. Caravans came from Persia. Ships arrived from the Mediterranean Sea. For a long time Antioch was a rich and bustling city. Even centuries later its walls remained powerful. When the Crusaders approached the city, they saw an impressive sight. Antioch stood in a wide valley. On one side it was surrounded by hills. On the other side flowed the Orontes River. But the most striking feature was its walls. Enormous walls surrounded the city. They stretched for many kilometers. Towers rose high above the ground. Some stood on hilltops, watching over the valley. When the Crusaders saw these walls, many realized something important. This city would not fall quickly. It would be a long siege. And indeed, the siege of Antioch became one of the hardest trials of the First Crusade. The Crusader army spread out around the city. Camps stretched across the valley. Tents stood in rows. Horses grazed nearby. Fires burned in the evenings. But surrounding such a large city completely was difficult. There were too many walls. Because of this, the defenders could sometimes still receive help from outside. Food caravans occasionally reached the city. Reinforcements sometimes arrived. This made the siege even more difficult. Time passed. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Autumn slowly turned into winter. The weather grew colder. Wind blew down from the mountains. Sometimes rain fell. Sometimes even snow. For many crusaders, this was unexpected. They had believed the East was always warm. But winters in these lands could be harsh, especially for people living in tents. Food gradually ran out. At first, they ate the supplies they had brought: bread, dried meat, cheese. But over time it became scarce. So crusaders searched the surrounding lands for food. Some rode to nearby villages, but such journeys could be dangerous. Enemy forces were active in the region. Sometimes skirmishes occurred. Sometimes people never returned. Hunger grew more serious. Horses weakened. People became ill. Life in the camp became difficult. Yet the siege continued. Each day the Crusaders watched the city walls, looking for weaknesses. Sometimes they built siege machines, wooden towers, catapults. But the defenders were ready. They watched every movement. If siege machines approached the walls, arrows flew. Stones were thrown down. Sometimes fierce battles erupted near the gates. But often days passed in waiting. Until finally, after months of struggle, a daring plan succeeded. One night a small group of crusaders secretly climbed a tower with the help of a traitor. Inside the city, the gate was opened. The Crusaders rushed in. Fighting broke out in the streets. And in the end, Antioch fell to the Crusaders. It was a great victory, but the victory did not bring peace. Soon another army arrived to retake the city. Now the Crusaders themselves were trapped inside, besieged. After another desperate struggle, they managed to hold the city. This victory gave the army new strength. Now the road to the south was open again. Jerusalem was closer, but the journey was not yet over. Mountains, hot plains, cities and fortresses. The road continued, and the Crusader army slowly moved forward, toward its final goal, toward the holy city of Jerusalem. Chapter 9. After the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, their journey did not end. On the contrary, a new chapter of history began. Many of the knights who had traveled the long road from Europe could have returned home. Some indeed did, but many decided to stay. They understood that conquering the city was only the beginning. Holding it would be far more difficult. The lands around Jerusalem were surrounded by states that were not willing to accept the appearance of a new Christian kingdom. Therefore, the Crusaders began to build a new system of power here. Thus appeared one of the most famous states of the Crusader era, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The new kingdom was far from Europe, very far. If a person wanted to reach it from France or Germany, the journey could take many months. Because of this, life here was different from the familiar life of Europe. The climate was different. The summers were hot and dry. The winters were milder than in Europe, but sometimes brought heavy rains. The landscapes were also different. Instead of the dense forests of Europe, there were hills, rocky plains, and scattered trees. For knights who were used to the green valleys of Europe, all of this seemed unusual. But gradually they began to adapt. European rulers divided the lands among themselves. Knights received territories. Sometimes these were cities, sometimes fortresses, sometimes large areas with villages. These lands were called fiefs. The owners of these lands had an important duty to defend the territory, because the new kingdom existed in constant danger. Sometimes armies of neighboring states carried out raids. Sometimes large wars broke out. Therefore, defense became the central concern of life. For this reason, the Crusaders began building fortresses, powerful stone castles. They were built on high hills or near important roads, sometimes beside cities, sometimes in remote places where trade routes passed. These castles were meant to protect the territory and serve as strongholds for the army. Stone walls rose high above the ground. Towers stood at the corners of the fortress. Sometimes a moat was dug around the castle. Inside there were courtyards, wells for water, storerooms filled with grain and supplies, workshops for weapons, and living quarters for soldiers. Hundreds of people could live inside such fortresses. If an enemy approached, the gates were closed, drawbridges were raised, and the garrison prepared for defense. Sometimes such castles could withstand sieges for months, sometimes even for years. Over time, many such castles appeared throughout the new Crusader states. Some were small, others were enormous, but all served the same purpose: to protect the lands of the Crusaders. One of the most famous fortresses was the castle of Crusades des Chevaliers. This castle stood on a high hill. From its walls one could see distant valleys. Roads passed below, and anyone traveling along those roads could easily be seen from the fortress. Crusades des Chevaliers was enormous. Its walls were extremely thick. Towers rose high above the fortress. Inside were long galleries, large halls, a chapel, storerooms for food, and wells. The garrison of the fortress could withstand a long siege. This made the castle almost impregnable. Today, nearly 1,000 years later, the walls of Crusades des Chevaliers still stand. And when modern travelers see this castle, they understand how powerful the fortifications of the Crusaders once were. But life in the new states was not only about wars and fortresses. Administration had to be organized. Cities had to be built. Roads had to be maintained. Different peoples lived in these lands. Local inhabitants spoke different languages. Different religions existed side by side. Because of this, life here was more complex than in European kingdoms. Some cities continued their normal daily life. Markets operated. Merchants traded goods. Caravans passed through the cities. Because the Middle East stood at the crossroads of major trade routes, roads from Asia to Europe passed through these lands. From India and Persia came spices, silk, precious goods, carpets, and European merchants also took part in this trade. Because of this, some Crusader cities became important trading centers. For example, the port city of Acre, a large harbor, was located there. Ships arrived from Italy, from Venice, from Genoa, from Pisa. Merchants unloaded their goods. In the markets, people sold fabrics, fruits, spices, metals. Gradually, this city became one of the busiest places in the region. But despite the trade and the growth of cities, life remained tense. Because the new kingdom was surrounded by powerful neighbors, sometimes large battles took place. Sometimes armies moved through these lands. For this reason, fortresses continued to play a huge role. They were the eyes and shield of the kingdom. If an enemy approached, the garrison would light signal fires. Nearby fortresses saw these signals and prepared for defense. In this way, the castles formed an entire network of protection. Each fortress supported the others, and together they protected the roads and cities. But gradually new organizations also appeared in these lands. Organizations that were meant to protect pilgrims and the roads. They consisted of people who combined two roles: the role of a monk and the role of a warrior. These were the military monastic orders, but we will speak about them in more detail in the second part of this chapter, because they would become one of the most mysterious and influential forces of the crusading era. Over time, new organizations began to appear in the Crusader lands. These organizations were unusual. They combined two roles, the role of a monk and the role of a warrior. In ordinary life, monks devoted themselves to prayer. They lived in monasteries, read sacred texts, helped the poor. But in these new lands, the situation was different. The roads between cities were dangerous. Pilgrims who continued to arrive from Europe were often attacked by bandits. Sometimes enemy troops attacked them. The journey to the holy city of Jerusalem remained difficult. So the idea appeared to create special brotherhoods that would be both religious and military. One of the most famous of these orders was the Order of the Templars. Its full name was much longer, the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. But most people simply called them the Templars. The name came from the word temple, because their first headquarters stood near the place, believed to be the site of the ancient temple in Jerusalem. The Templars took special vows. They promised to live modestly. They renounced personal wealth. They swore loyalty to their order and pledged to protect Christian pilgrims. Their clothing was simple, a white cloak, on the chest, a red cross. This symbol became one of the most recognizable in the Middle Ages. The Templars were well organized. They built fortresses. They guarded roads. They escorted pilgrims. Over time, their influence became very great. But the Templars were not the only order. There was another famous order, the Order of the Hospitallers. Their story began somewhat earlier. At first, they were a group that cared for sick pilgrims. They maintained a hospital in Jerusalem. Their people could receive help, rest after the long journey, receive food and water. But gradually, this order also became military. Its knights began to defend roads and fortresses. Thus, a special system of protection appeared in the new states: fortresses, military orders, knights, city garrisons. All of them worked together to hold the lands of the Crusaders. But life in these lands was not only military. People continued to live ordinary lives. Markets opened in cities. Craftsmen worked in workshops. Bakers baked bread. Blacksmiths forged weapons. Merchants traded goods. Sometimes many languages could be heard in the streets: Latin, French, Greek, Arabic, Armenian. These lands were a crossroads of cultures. People of many nations lived side by side. Sometimes conflicts arose between them, but often they simply continued their lives, trading, working, building homes. In Jerusalem, life also gradually returned. The city had suffered greatly during its capture, but over time its streets filled with people again. Pilgrims came to the holy sites. They visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They prayed. They lit candles. For many of them, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. A journey that might have begun in a small village in France or Germany ended here, in the Holy City. But the rulers of the new kingdom had to think about the future, because holding these lands was much harder than conquering them. The armies of neighboring states watched events carefully. Sometimes small wars broke out. Sometimes temporary peace agreements were made. The history of these lands became complex and tense. Yet despite all difficulties, the Crusader states survived for decades. New fortresses were built. Cities developed. Pilgrims continued to arrive. And Europe continued to support these states. New knights traveled to the east. Some stayed. Others returned home. But the memory of the First Crusade continued to live on. In chronicles, in stories, in songs, people spoke about the great journey, about the road thousands of kilometers long, about cities taken after long sieges, about the holy city of Jerusalem. But the history of the Crusades did not end there. On the contrary, it was only beginning, because decades later new crusades would appear, new armies, new heroes, and new enemies. One of the most famous kings of that time would be the English ruler, Richard the Lionheart, and his opponent would be one of the most famous rulers of the East, Saladin. The story of their rivalry would become a legend. Chapter 8. After many long months of travel, the Crusader army finally approached its goal. This was the moment many of them had dreamed about since the beginning of the journey. Since leaving their homes in Europe, a great deal of time had passed. Some had been traveling for more than 2 years. During that time they had crossed enormous distances. They had passed through mountains and plains, through forests and barren lands, through cities and fortresses. They had endured hunger. They had survived cold winters. They had fought difficult battles. Many of those who began the journey were no longer alive, but those who remained continued forward, because their goal lay ahead, the holy city, Jerusalem. In the summer of 1099, the Crusaders finally approached these lands. The landscape gradually changed. The hills became drier. Trees appeared less often. The sun shone hot and bright. The roads were dusty. Sometimes the wind lifted fine sand into the air. And yet among these hills stood the city people in Europe had heard about their entire lives. One morning the Crusaders climbed a high hill, and before them appeared the city, Jerusalem. It stood on a rise in the land, surrounded by stone walls. Towers rose above the city. Domes of temples shone in the sunlight. For many Crusaders, it was an incredible moment. Some stopped. Some fell to their knees. Some began to pray, because the road that had begun far away in Europe had finally brought them here, to the city they considered sacred. Chronicles of the time say that many people wept, from exhaustion, from joy, from relief. But despite this moment, the Crusaders understood something important. Jerusalem did not yet belong to them. The city was defended. High walls surrounded it. Behind them stood soldiers ready to defend the city. And this meant that another challenge awaited the Crusaders. A siege. The army settled around the city. Camps appeared on the hills. Tents stretched across the land. Soldiers watched the walls. Scouts studied the defenses. Soon it became clear the siege would be difficult. The summer heat was intense. The sun stood high above the hills. The air grew heavy. The greatest problem was water. There was little of it in these lands. Sources were far away. Groups of soldiers had to search for water in the surrounding countryside. Sometimes this was dangerous. Defenders could attack these groups. But despite the difficulties, the Crusaders prepared for an assault. They knew waiting forever was impossible. Siege machines had to be built. Work began. Wood was gathered. Sometimes it had to be brought from far away because there were few forests near Jerusalem. From these boards they built siege towers, tall wooden structures on wheels. They would allow soldiers to reach the level of the city walls. They also built ladders, long wooden ladders placed against the walls, and great battering rams, heavy logs used to strike the gates. The work took many days. Soldiers labored under the burning sun. They rested. They prayed. They spoke quietly about the coming battle. In the evenings the camp grew quiet. Firelight illuminated the hills. Men sat together. Some told stories. Some prayed. Because everyone understood the decisive moment was near. At last the day of the assault arrived. Siege towers rolled toward the walls. Men pushed them forward. Soldiers held shields above their heads to protect themselves from arrows. From the walls defenders fired arrows. They threw stones. They poured burning pitch. The noise of battle filled the air. Shouts. Clashing weapons. Soldiers climbed ladders. Some fell. Others continued climbing. The siege towers reached the walls. At last soldiers crossed onto the city walls. Fighting erupted. One of the most intense moments of the siege had begun. Slowly the Crusaders pushed forward. Eventually the walls were breached. The gates were opened. The army entered the city. Jerusalem had fallen to the Crusaders. For many it was a moment of immense importance. They believed they had fulfilled their mission. But with victory came tragedy. Fierce fighting filled the city. Many inhabitants died. Medieval wars were often brutal, and this day was no exception. For the Crusaders, however, the capture of Jerusalem meant the end of a long journey. Some went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They removed their armor. They prayed. They thanked God for allowing them to reach this place. But the story did not end here, because after the conquest, a new phase began. The Crusaders decided to remain in these lands, to build new states, to construct fortresses, to control the roads. One of these states became known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Chapter 10. Over time, new changes began to take place in the lands of the Crusaders. The states that had been created after the First Crusade continued to exist, but their situation remained difficult. These kingdoms were far from Europe. They were surrounded by other states, and their security depended on many factors. Sometimes new armies arrived from Europe. Sometimes long periods of relative peace followed, but the tension never completely disappeared. Over time, special military orders became firmly established in these lands. We have already spoken about some of them. The Order of the Templars, the Order of the Hospitallers. Later, another famous order appeared, the Teutonic Order. These organizations played an important role in the life of the Crusader states. Their knights took monastic vows. They promised to live modestly, to obey the rules of the order, and to defend Christian lands. They could be recognized by their clothing. The Templars wore white cloaks with a red cross. The Hospitallers wore black cloaks with a white cross. The Teutonic Knights wore white cloaks with a black cross. These symbols were known throughout Europe. The military orders built fortresses. They guarded roads. They escorted pilgrims. And sometimes they took part in major battles. Their discipline was strict. Life in the order followed clear rules. Knights woke early. They took part in prayers. They trained. They checked their weapons and armor. They stood guard on the walls of fortresses. Sometimes they went on long patrols. They inspected roads. They watched over the safety of the territories. Thanks to such orders, many roads between cities remained relatively safe. But over time, the situation in the Middle East began to change. In the East, a new powerful ruler appeared. His name was Saladin. He was a talented military commander and a skilled ruler. He managed to unite many Muslim lands, Egypt, Syria, and other territories. This unification became an important event, because before that, the Muslim states had often been divided. Now they had a common leader, and that leader decided to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem. Saladin began preparing for war. He gathered armies, formed alliances, planned military campaigns. Meanwhile, events were also unfolding in Europe. When news of new conflicts reached the Western kingdoms, many rulers began discussing a new crusade. Among them was one of the most famous kings of the Middle Ages, the King of England, Richard I. History remembers him by the name Richard the Lionheart. He was known as a brave warrior, a strong leader, and an experienced military commander. Richard took part in many battles. He was a man who spent much of his life on campaign. When the Third Crusade began, Richard became one of its main leaders. Armies once again began gathering in Europe. Knights prepared their weapons. Ships were built in the ports. Merchants supplied provisions. Thousands of people once again prepared for a long journey. Many of them knew the stories of the First Crusade. They had heard about the capture of Jerusalem, about great sieges, about long roads across continents. Now they were preparing to repeat that journey. The journey to the east began once again. Armies traveled by sea and by land. They headed toward the lands where Crusader states already existed. But meanwhile, events in the east were developing quickly. In 1187, one of the most famous battles of that time took place, the Battle of Hattin. In this battle, the Crusader army suffered a heavy defeat. After this victory, Saladin was able to retake Jerusalem. This became an enormous event. The news quickly spread across Europe. Many people were shocked. The city that was considered the most sacred place of the Christian world in the East had once again come under Muslim rule. It was this event that led to a new crusade. When the armies of the Third Crusade arrived in the East, a new series of battles began. Richard the Lionheart proved himself to be a talented military leader. He took part in the sieges of cities. He commanded armies in battle. One of the important events was the siege of the city of Acre. This port city was extremely important. After a long siege, it was captured by the Crusaders. But despite these victories, retaking Jerusalem proved far more difficult. The armies of Richard and Saladin met several times in battle. Sometimes fierce fighting took place. Sometimes the two sides simply watched one another. Yet chronicles of that time preserve interesting stories. Stories of mutual respect between the two leaders. Despite being enemies, Richard and Saladin respected each other as commanders. It was said that sometimes they exchanged gifts. Sometimes they sent messages to one another. These stories became part of the legends of the Middle Ages. In the end, the Third Crusade was unable to retake Jerusalem, but an agreement was reached. Christian pilgrims were allowed to visit the Holy City. This preserved the possibility of pilgrimage, and although wars continued for many years afterward, this period became one of the most famous episodes of the crusading era. The history of the Crusades continued for many more years. New crusades appeared, new leaders, new wars, but the events of the First Crusade and the era of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin remain forever in people's memory. These stories were written in chronicles, passed on in stories, and turned into legends. And today, almost 1,000 years later, we still remember that era. An era of long roads, stone castles, and people who set out on journeys across continents. Journeys that changed history and left a mark in the memory of many generations. Chapter 11. Over time, the world around the Crusader states began to change. Years passed, decades followed one another. Cities changed hands. Rulers came and went. Armies arrived and departed. Gradually, the power of the European states in the East began to weaken. In the 13th century, the last Crusader fortresses in the Holy Land began to disappear. One of the final major cities was the port of Acre. For a long time, it had remained an important center of trade and military power for the Crusaders. But in 1291, the city fell. After this event, European states no longer controlled the lands of the Holy Land. The Crusader states disappeared. Knights and military orders began returning to Europe. Among them was one of the most famous orders of the Middle Ages, the Knights Templar. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had played an important role. They protected pilgrims, built fortresses, and took part in crusading campaigns. Over time, the order became very wealthy and influential. The Templars owned lands in many countries across Europe. They had castles, farms, and houses. They were even involved in financial affairs. Some kings kept their money with the Templars because the order was considered trustworthy. But this wealth and influence gradually began to cause concern, especially for one ruler, the King of France, Philip IV. By the beginning of the 14th century, the French king was in a difficult financial situation. He owed large sums of money. Some of these debts were connected to the Templars. Gradually, the king began to grow suspicious of the order. He feared their independence and their influence. In the autumn of 1307, an event occurred that marked the beginning of the end for the order. By the king's command, Templars across France were arrested. It happened early in the morning. Many knights were caught completely by surprise. They were accused of serious crimes. Some of these accusations were very strange. The knights were accused of heresy, secret rituals, and other violations of church rules. Long investigations and interrogations followed. For several years, the fate of the order remained uncertain. Eventually, the Pope decided to dissolve the Order of the Knights Templar. This happened in 1312. Officially, the order ceased to exist. But the story did not end there. The last Grand Master of the order was Jacques de Molay. He spent many years in prison. In the spring of 1314, the final trial took place in Paris. After many years of investigation, a decision was made to execute several leaders of the order. On one day in March of that year, a stake was set up on an island in the middle of the River Seine in Paris. Jacques de Molay and several other leaders of the order were brought there. Chronicles say that they remained calm until the very end. Thus ended the history of the Knights Templar, an order that had once protected the roads to Jerusalem and built fortresses in the east. Over time, many legends appeared around the Templars. Historians continue to study their story even today, and the old castles they built still stand on the hills of Europe and the Middle East. They remind us of a time when knights set out on distant journeys across seas and deserts. The age of the Crusades slowly passed into history, but the memory of it remained in chronicles, in ancient cities, and in the stories people continue to tell many centuries later. Final chapter. Now our journey slowly comes to an end. We have traveled far, from the quiet villages of medieval Europe, where church bells rang in the morning and mist rose above the fields, to the distant roads that crossed mountains and plains, ancient cities, and stone fortresses. At the end of that long road stood the ancient city of Jerusalem, a city sacred to many peoples and religions. The story of the Crusades is complex. It is filled with hopes and fears, long journeys, and the lives of thousands of people. Today these journeys exist mostly in old books and chronicles. But if we imagine quietly enough, we can almost see that world again. Slow caravans moving along dusty roads, fires burning in night camps, stars shining over silent plains, and distant cities glowing in the light of torches. But now the night grows quieter. The story gently fades. The world slows down. Let this ancient history slowly dissolve into the silence of the night. Let your thoughts become calm. Let your breathing become slow and steady. And let the distant roads of the Middle Ages remain far in the past. Ahead there is only quiet, peace and deep, restful sleep. Good night.